Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to jump right in. The first thing I've been doing recently is asking a Zen question
Mm,
from an old Zen koan. I just wanted to see what you have to say about it.
sure.
The question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to?
All things return to the one. Where does the one return to? The one returns to itself. It's like those Russian dolls that you just keep pulling out, pulling out, pulling out.
Yeah.
So it's just like spiraling in and amongst itself. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but NASA, just released some new photographs of a black hole, and
Oh, I haven't seen that.
it's incredible. You know what I mean? So the one, this idea of the one, we could only try to conceptualize and
Of
understand what it
course.
means, but
Of course.
there's really no way of knowing what one goes into and what one comes out of. But
Right.
my answer is that it infinitely keeps coming and going.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So, I realized when I was thinking about doing this conversation with you that we have talked some about, each of our past and stuff with each other, but
Yeah.
I didn't really know too much about your upbringing in terms of how religious it was. So did you grow up in a religious family at all?
No, I'm from Long Island originally. I've been in LA 10 years, now in Topanga, but originally from Long Island and, was raised Jewish, was bar mitzvahed. But I think the key thing was my family escaped the Holocaust. You know what I mean? Some of them didn't escape and died, but my grandparents did and got over here, to America and to New York. And so my mom's parents landed in the Bronx, and it was just like assimilate, assimilate, assimilate. You know what I mean? Like, we don't want to walk around with like targets on our back or any blaring obvious, that we don't fit in or we're not from here. So I did kind of grow up with that sort of energy, like just, and so I think we lost a lot of the deep religious spirituality of Judaism. But I still was bar mitzvahed. I still went to Hebrew school. But it was called Reform. I don't know if you know the different sects of Judaism, but Reform is like the most basic, and non-religious. So that's how I was raised.
Okay.
Going to temple on the high holidays and stuff like that. But something never really fully clicked for me.
Right. Inside the house, were your parents, do you feel like they had any sort of spirituality within themselves, inside the house?
No, I mean, my parents, and they'd probably be the first to tell you, not very religious or spiritual. I don't know where my spirituality came from. Maybe it came from that. They were New York street kids, city kids. And just, my dad was a street kid, had every job under the sun, just trying to make ends meet, was on his own by, 16, 17. His father passed away when he was 6. So my grandfather, died very young. And, my mom, not at all. They did end up years later before having me, they did a little bit of TM.
Oh, interesting.
And they were given a mantra that they both still remember to this day, surprisingly enough. And I think they both attend to maybe use it like when they, for whatever reason, just in a moment of real stress or panic or anxiety, sometimes they'll just bubble up in them and they'll be like, wow, I'm surprised I'm even remembering that right now.
Right.
But no, other than that, I mean, I grew up with a typical Long Island upbringing. I don't know if you know, but Long Island is actually the birthplace of the suburbs.
Interesting. Okay.
So I've always found that interesting, to use your word. Like, I literally grew up where the suburbs kind of
Originated, yeah.
and it always kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. Like the 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, the commuting into Manhattan, from Long Island on the train, and that whole thing that seemed like so cool. And like what people were aspiring to when I was born and started having my own thoughts, I was like, that's weird. That's a weird like way to live.
Yeah. So when is it that you remember kind of your own spirituality getting sparked?
Yeah, I mean, I think music was one of the first things that really did it for me. I'm a Deadhead, for those listening or watching, that don't know that Grateful Dead. So I got really big into Grateful Dead and The Doors and Jimi Hendrix and at a pretty early age. So that was, I think, kind of a little bit of my foray into spirituality. Those artists, I feel like, opened up my mind a little bit.
Yeah.
I also got into reading and writing at a young age. So, Jack Kerouac and Jim Morrison's poetry kind of, once I got into him, then he opened up the world of poetry. And I was, hanging out in my room, burning incense and lava lamps, like at a young age. And I have a picture of myself with a brace from like my braces, like to like straighten my teeth out, wrapped around my neck. And I'm like at my altar, like lighting candles and incense with like black light posters at like 12, 13 years old. I mean, I don't know where
Uh,
that came from, but it just something was in me, and then as a little kid, I remember just being very cognizant of people's feelings and emotions and like being friends with everybody and defending kids that got picked on. Like, I don't know where it came from, but I
mm,
always had this weird, inclination to empathy and compassion, and so that music sort of sparked it, and it's been an ongoing journey ever since.
yeah. Yeah, that's a cool answer. And I know for me, I mean, The Doors, and my brother was always obsessed with Grateful Dead. I like Grateful Dead, but I never went through a personal, like, huge, passionate period in my life where I was listening to a lot of Grateful Dead. But I did that with The Doors, and I guess certain other bands from the '60s that fueled my spirituality as
Yeah,
well. Not quite as early as what you're saying, but when I was in middle school, high school, I was burning incense and all that stuff too. So
yeah,
I feel you.
yeah,
Well, before I want to ask you obviously about Zen and stuff and how you move specifically towards Zen. But
yeah.
before that, I wanted to ask, do you have any memories from when you were a kid or teenager that were, kind of mysterious or mystical, anything like that?
um I feel like it's actually been happening more as I've gotten older and being more present, and I think through meditation. um
Can you think of any that were more recent, maybe, if you can't think of any from early on?
Yeah, well, I actually, you're peripherally sort of affiliated with some of these stuff. It's do you remember when we were doing our creative writing workshops? The early days of them. I would text you with like a weird coincidence,
Yeah, that's right.
like right after like something relevant, like if someone was talking about gummy bears, I would all of a sudden, like, I would see like a pack of gummy bears like right away. Or so there's a book called When God Winks that talks about like the nature of coincidences. So I use those as the primary, like, um I forget what term you used just now, but like spiritual sort of,
Oh yeah, it seems like you're describing kind of synchronicities, I guess.
yeah, I use synchronicities as a frame of reference for me. And then what tends to happen to me a lot is I'm a big reader, and I'm always just fascinated by the fact that I always seem to be reading books that the author like talks about something that's like literally happening to me, like at the same moment. Like the author is referring to a certain time, like Halloween, let's say, or you know what I mean? And
Right.
I'm literally reading the book like over Halloween, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what's the chance of that? Because there's probably been, millions of people that have read this book, and like I'm happy to. And so there's been a lot of weird synchronicities and coincidences with the books I've read.
Yes.
And then I think just by paying attention, you notice a lot of synchronicities. At least I have in my own
Yes.
life with coincidences with animals, and that actually makes me think when I mentioned that is about a year ago, a wild peacock landed on my property, and it was super cool. And she stayed ever since. She's been on my property for a year now.
That's awesome.
And one of the first times that she appeared, she hangs up on my roof where I have like an A-frame kind of like window, and there's there's a roof that she could sit on and look right into my place from the roof. And one morning at like 6 a.m., I woke up to meditate, and she was already up on the roof. And I sat facing the wall, as we do in Zazen. And she turned around and was facing the same direction as me for the entire half hour, like literally from when I rang the bell until when I rang it to end. She sat there and like almost knew like when the meditation was up, and then she turned around, and I ended up writing a poem about it, that I just needed to share that experience, and
Yeah.
a couple of people that have read it got all emotional and cried from it. So yeah, we talk about Zen, these enlightenment experiences. They come and they go, and you get a glimpse. They're hard to hold on to.
Right.
So that's just some examples, I guess.
No, that's good. Yeah. And that, I mean, they, synchronicities abound all the time. And like you said, you just kind of, if you're paying attention, you're going to see them. And yeah, it's probably wise to not hang on to them too tightly, but at the same time, it's nice to feel, in awe of the mystery of those sorts of things. And
yeah.
I agree with books specifically for years and years. Synchronicities seem to be tied to the books I'm reading all the time, whether like you're saying, I'm reading a book and then something in my external world at that moment, or just the period of time in my life totally aligns with what's going on in the book. Or even I remember last year I felt the desire to read this one specific book, and then it's a book that I really love, and I posted a picture of it on Instagram that day, and then I looked back at somehow my memories of Instagram, the exact day, the year prior, I was reading that book. And so I think there's this seasonal thing that happens with me where like the books that I reread, often without even realizing it, I pick those books up at the exact same time of year and stuff like that.
That's interesting.
It's beautiful. So at what age did you start becoming interested in Zen specifically?
Yeah, I think going back to the books again, I've been reading, I almost feel like all the books and authors that I read are in a weird way, like a part of like some underground, group or something like that.
Yeah.
This kind of like spiritual, underground network. And so
yeah.
I was reading a lot of spiritual books, some classics, that are pretty famous for getting people kind of on the path or at least interested. But then the first book, I actually think I have it somewhere nearby, but was Lama Surya, and he's written a couple, Awakening the Buddhist Heart and Awakening the Buddha Within. And those were like the first two like Buddhist books I read. Obviously, Jack Kerouac talks about it in Dharma Bums on the Road, and there's references of it in Grateful Dead music and everything. But those were the first two books that were like really traditional Buddhist. And then I got into a little bit of Thich Nhat Hanh. And that kind of started opening me up. And then I read a book called the Jew and the Lotus, which is about Jewish people, for whatever reason, gravitating towards Buddhism. And this guy coined the term Jubu, which I started calling myself after that. I was like, I'm definitely a Jubu,
Yeah.
And so again, talking about some synchronicities, I was living on Long Island at the time, and I was just driving through a random neighborhood not far from my house, and I saw a Buddhist, temple. I'd never seen a Buddhist temple in my life. And I stopped in awe. Like I literally pulled my car over on the side of the road and was just like looking at it in awe. And all of a sudden a monk comes out from like one of the side doors, and he like pours out a bucket of water, like, some like sink water or something. And he was in his like orange, like saffron robes and shaved head. And I was just like, just completely, in awe. And it stayed with me, and then I went back a couple of weeks later, and I pulled into the parking lot this time. I pulled into a parking spot, and I was ready to get out. And I was like, what do you even like say? I don't even know what to even say or do. Like, what am I going to just knock on the door and say, hey, I didn't know anything. So I got back in my car, I pulled out of the parking spot, and I drove away.
Yeah.
And then a little while after that, I ended up moving to LA, and I was going through a little bit of a rough period, and I moved out here to sell solar power, and that wasn't going well. And I was living on an air mattress in a friend's house in Irvine, in Orange County. And I was low on cash in a new, state across the country from where I grew up with a dog. And, instead of turning to drugs or alcohol or, wild sex, I just went to Barnes and Noble and I went to the Eastern religion section. I was like, I need a good book right now. That's what I felt like I needed at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking on the bookshelf and a, a book just jumps out at me, the spine, and you already know where this is going. But the title of the book was Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate by Brad Warner. And it was turquoise and all these crazy fonts and colors. And I pulled out the book and I read the back and I was like, this sounds cool. I'm like, I'm already interested in Buddhism, but I don't know so much about Zen. And this guy seems to have a cool, fresh take on it. So I bought the book and I just crushed it the next couple of days. I Googled him, and at the time it was a small group called Dogen Sangha Los Angeles. And I emailed the group at, the website that I found, and it was a guy named John who has become a really good friend of mine. And John wrote back and said, hey, we sit every Saturday morning. Feel free to show up. And so eventually I showed up, and they were just sitting once a week, and I learned how to sit Zazen for the first time in that group. I learned about Dogen and Shobogenzo and the initial foundations. And I don't know, Matthew, there was just something for me about those first couple of sessions of Zazen. Like I could almost cry, talking about that, because I think just being a fast-paced New Yorker that was like entrepreneurial and like playing lacrosse and moving cross country, like just sitting down for the first time in my life, really, and doing like a proper meditation. Like I used to always go down to the river and the lake and the ocean, right? But I'm talking about absolute stillness and silence.
Yeah.
Eyes open, blank white wall, jackhammers going on in the outside, cars whizzing past, and sitting there in your discomfort. You know what I mean? I think something for me just clicked.
Wow.
And I was like, this is what I've been looking for. Like, I don't need Bibles, and I don't need, doctrines and dogmas. I just need to sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
And that's another book that Brad wrote also,
Yeah.
I mean? So yeah, that's how I found Zen, finding it through Brad's book at a Barnes and Noble in Irvine.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that seems synchronistic in itself for sure.
Yeah.
And the timing was crucial there. You sounded like you were going maybe through a rough patch, and then finding that Sangha and finding Zen and finding that book really maybe helped lift you out of that.
Yeah, and that was 10 years ago.
Yeah, there you go. That's beautiful. So that started in Santa Monica, right?
Yeah.
Or is that where they met first? Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's it's beautiful that it's still going, still thriving. And I mean, you kind of touched on it there in terms of what has kept Zen a primary spiritual focus for you, and maybe in a practice and a tradition that you can really resonate with. And is it mainly aside from the Zazen and how useful that can be and how practical that is and how bare bones it is there anything else about Zen that makes you gravitate toward that more than other spiritual paths?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is yes. And I think for me, where it started to click was retreat. Because the practice itself is great. I'm leading a meditation right now with my company every Wednesday morning, and someone just asked me this morning, like, what's I'm interested in TM, transcendental meditation, for those who don't know what TM stands for. And he was asking the differences, and there are a lot of modalities out there. There are a lot of types of meditation. I even sometimes will go outside and do like a moonlight, meditation at nighttime. And I'm still doing kind of Zazen, but not as maybe formally, and so I do dabble with other different things, but obviously Zen is my main practice. And I think it clicked for me on retreat, because when you go on retreat, you do something called Samu, which is work period. And that's supposed to be like taking the meditation off the cushion, and now you're sweeping, but you're still meditating basically.
Right.
You're chopping vegetables, you're cleaning toilets, but you're still kind of in a meditative mindset. And then in between our sitting sessions, we do something called kinhin, which is walking meditation. And that's also teaching you to now be in movement as an extension of the meditation. And so those two things, if you really think about it, you know what I mean? Okay, so we spend time meditating, actually sitting on the cushion, but then we go up and we start walking. And then we get up and we start doing chores. That's that sort of is the entire human experience. I mean, of
Right.
course, yeah, you could throw in chores. I would put our work and our day jobs into the chore category.
Right.
And then walking is like any kind of like driving, like any kind of
Movement from one place to another type of thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then everything in between, you know what I mean, is can be sort of like, associated with like meditation and just being present and mindful. So I think those additional like ancillary sort of practices of the Zen tradition have really resonated with me. And then of course, like all the literature that's associated with it. And, I think Dogen and the idea that our tradition, and I'm referring to you, but the Soto Zen lineage has a real focus on Zazen and everything else sort of just being like icing on the cake. I think that resonates with me because, I'm a part of some yoga communities and Hindu communities, and, I love all the other traditions, and there's some great stuff in other, practices. But I think what makes Zen unique is like always coming back to like the meditation as being like the foundation, because there's a quote from the Dhammapada that I'll probably butcher, you know what I mean? But the Buddha basically says, we all that we are is taking place in our minds, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
that is our entire existence, is what's happening
Yep.
here.
Yep.
And so with Zazen, the focus obviously is clearing out the mind, clearing out the clutter, settling, the noise and all the chatter. And so for me, I just keep coming back to that. It's like, who cares about all the books, all the literature, all,
Right.
all the other stuff? It's like, to me, that's like the meat of the practice. And as long as I keep focusing on that, the results will kind of just, fall where they may. So
yeah, that's cool. I like how you brought up the the component during retreat, which I actually have not been on a retreat, and I totally need to.
yeah,
But I like what you said, because I think it's easy, since Soto Zen specifically puts so much emphasis on Zazen. I think it's easy to, for me, I guess I'm always like, well, there does need to be emphasis off the cushion as well. And you're saying that there actually is, even in Soto Zen, there's actually a lot of emphasis on carrying on that kind of zazen mind state or
yeah,
approach toward things beyond, off the cushion that are just really basic things that fill up our days.
right.
And so it dissolves the boundary between straight up sitting and doing something else. And so I really like that.
It actually even goes a couple layers further, because in a Zen temple, um, the chef, what I mean, is like, the cook is like the most important person, you know what I mean? So then cooking and preparing meals mindfully becomes a big part of the practice. And then when we're on retreat, we eat in silence. And, it's considered like oryoki. So it's like, eating and meals takes up another big portion of a human being's existence, right? So then you learn to eat your meals more mindfully. And
you froze up a little bit.
Am I here?
Okay, you're back. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, the meals and the food is a big part, of the practice as well. So that's another layer that, you sort of start to get to. And then of course, Matthew, the Zen tradition has a huge, community of calligraphers and poets. And, there's a lot of famous musicians like Leonard Cohen and Herbie Hancock that are like very famous Zen practitioners. And then Phil Jackson and basketball. So, I know that it could get a little bit of the stigma as being like that very stoic, like always meditating kind of modality, but I think it's way deeper than that.
It totally is. Yeah. What's the longest retreat you've been on? I'm just curious.
It's funny you asked that. So a 3-day retreat is the longest I've done.
Okay.
And I just met for lunch this week the head monk at Mount Baldy, who I've become good friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of challenged me to maybe, step it up and challenge myself further in my practice, and maybe go on a retreat that's 5 days, or a work period that's 3 months even.
Mm.
So it's a lot to consider. So the answer to your question is 3 days.
Yeah.
But I'm also I've been living in Topanga by myself, on a mountaintop for 2.5 years. So I sort of have been on retreat for 2.5 years.
Right.
So I do consider that a form of my practice as well. But I am looking to maybe step up the retreat, experience a little bit deeper, because something does happen on retreat that cannot be, that is not really translatable to like our normal day-to-day lives, because you're really stripping yourself away of a lot of communication, and it's really powerful.
Yeah. Before we move on to something else, I wanted to just, as a last point about practice, because I try to kind of focus on 3 main things in these episodes, experience, spiritual philosophy, and practice. We've touched on experience a good bit, and we've touched on practice. Before we move, I want to ask you about your spiritual philosophy, and we've touched a little bit on that, but I want to hear kind of how you view your own spiritual philosophy. But it seems like you have a pretty disciplined practice yourself, right?
Yeah.
Do you do Zazen pretty much every day?
Yeah.
In the morning or at night, or both?
Both. Typically both, but morning I don't really waver from morning.
Mm-hmm.
Nighttime, if I'm feeling extremely lazy and I just want to put something on Netflix, and just completely veg out, or read a book even, write, I will sometimes skip the nighttime, but I do not skip the morning unless, I do sometimes give myself a break if I'm traveling. Like there's just sometimes where, I'll do a little bit of yoga and stretching and breath work. I maybe won't do a full, Zazen session. But if I'm home and it's, which I usually am, obviously, I usually sit, between 20 and 30 minutes every morning religiously. And I usually do sit at nighttime also. Nighttime, Nishijima, who's Brad's teacher and, my sort of, our grandfather Zen teacher, talks about the nighttime one being like less formal, in that like you could sit maybe until you get sleepy or tired, whereas the morning one, I ring bells and it's a little bit more formal. I try to sit for whatever length of time I've decided on, usually a half hour. But nighttime, it's like, if it's dark and I'm tired, like I might just sit until I'm like basically falling asleep, you know what I mean? And then I'll just get up,
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, I've also gotten into the habit of going outside. I love sitting. The other night, Matthew, I did a moonlight meditation where it was a full moon. This was like 2 nights ago.
Yeah.
I was sitting outside overlooking the canyon, and the moon was like completely parallel with my forehead. The moon was like literally hitting me in the third eye. And I just sat there, and it was really, really powerful. And so that's not something that's normally practiced in Zen, you know what I mean? But I've kind of embraced it living out in nature.
Sure.
And it gives me a different feeling, sometimes sitting outside versus always staring at the wall.
Oh yeah. It's funny that you mentioned Jack Kerouac earlier. I meant to mention this early on in the conversation, but I think that there have been 4 people that I've talked to on this podcast that whenever Buddhism comes up, if that person has, gotten into Buddhism at all, it's Jack Kerouac is one of the first seeds that plants, one of the first people that plants that seed for them, and that's true for me as well.
Yep.
So it's pretty incredible actually that he brought so many people to an interest in Buddhism.
I mean, that book, his writings are historic. Obviously, the whole Beat generation. I know they get sometimes a little bit of a bad rap, but they were the initial conduits from the East, to the West. I mean, obviously the teachers had to come over, like Shunryu Suzuki, you know what I mean, and DT Suzuki, and Thich Nhat Hanh, and like people had to come over from the East. But those guys were kind of like the first pop culture, and obviously the Grateful Dead, you know what I mean, and that whole sort of era. of Kankisi and the electrolytic acid
Right.
tests and stuff.
Right.
So, they were the initial seed. And when you talk about Zen, there's a sect of Zen that I'm fascinated by called Yogacara.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know it, it's YOGA, like yoga, but then CARA. And they were like the original sort of like psychologists of Buddhism and of Zen in particular. And they talk a lot about the planting of seeds. And I think that the Beat Generation were some of the original seed planters of Buddhism in the West. And so they get a lot of credit for that. I think it's growing and evolving. And Tassajara and San Francisco Zen Center and Zen Shuji downtown LA were the original like sort of traditional Japanese Zen, temples and organizations. And now places like us are branching out. But
Right.
the Beat Generation were a big part of bringing it to the mainstream, and I think they should be kind of immortalized for that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there was, I don't know, there's a lot to say there, but as far as pop culture goes, they definitely brought it into the pop culture, and even if maybe academics or certain fringe things that were happening interested in Buddhism, Ginsburg and Kerouac and Gary Snyder and all those folks really they kind of made it hip in a good way, really, because it made people genuinely interested in it, and it obviously wasn't just superficial, and they were sincere seekers.
Yeah, and there's one other thing I think is important to remember about Kerouac that I always appreciated about him is his connection to nature. I think that sometimes like Zen could lose a little bit of focus on that. I've tried to do that in my practice, partly why I moved up here. But there's always this joke with ACZC and me. It's like the city center and then like the mountain center. You know what I mean? But the reason why a lot of monasteries are put on the mountains is like you don't want to lose touch with society and like the real world. But there is something about practice taking place when it's a little bit quieter and a little bit more remote. And Kerouac always put an emphasis on getting out into nature. Sure. And that's something I've kind of maintained throughout my practice is going on hikes. I know you and I both have a love of the desert.
Yeah.
And I think when you're practicing in the city, it's like, that's great. But like, Dogen wrote some really famous, pieces in the Shobogenzo, the Rivers and Mountains Sutras, you know what I mean? And like the importance of, nature being the Dharma.
Yeah.
We don't even need books.
Yeah.
The teachings are, right outside our windows in a lot of cases, you know what I mean?
Right.
So I think it's important. And Kerouac always came back to that. So that's another thing I think, I connected with his writings about was not only the Zen and the Buddhism, but also his connection to nature.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got into Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau before I got into the Beats.
Yeah.
It was around the same time in my life, but they preceded me getting into the Beats. And I remember I took a independent studies class where it was just me and this one professor, because he's actually the one who got me interested in Emerson and stuff. So I knew he knew a lot about it. And then I asked him if he'd be willing to do an independent study with me about the Transcendentalist. And so that was the main focus of our independent study. But the final essay I wrote for that, he wanted me to choose a more, basically a text from the 20th century that somehow was in conversation with some of the romantic transcendentalist stuff. And I remember I chose Dharma Bums for that. So and it was mainly the focus on nature, like you're saying. It was, and so I saw that parallel as well. And I definitely value that. And I like what you're saying, nature is the Dharma, and we don't necessarily need books. We just need to look right in front of us. And, I think it is important to preserve all the beautiful things about practice in an urban space and in the chaos of the modern world. But nevertheless, we can't forget how healing and important the natural world is, of course.
Yeah.
So anything else that you could say about your own spiritual philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I've since recently launched a little business, where I'm helping people with the meditation mindfulness practice. trying to help people find a more Zen sort of lifestyle. I've been this figure to a lot of people in my life for a long time, and I decided to make it more public facing. So I am working on like my philosophy, my curriculum. You know, I mean, if people come to me and working with me, you know, what they could kind of expect. And honestly, Matthew, I had a weird epiphany one morning, sitting at like 6 a.m. doing zazen, still dark out, and it was like kind of one of those aha moments where I literally figured out. I felt like I figured out not the meaning of life, but I felt like I figured out how to do life.
Mm.
And to me, it's kind of simple. And I think we all have some level of understanding and conceptualization and even experience of it. But I'll try to frame it for you, you know what I mean, based off of your question. And I actually have a whole diagram that I've built out with like arrows and, imagery to explain what I'm going to try to explain to you.
I love it.
Which is basically, I was looking at my life, and I've done a lot of cool things that we haven't touched on yet, but I was an original contestant on the pilot episode of Shark Tank, from a brand that I'd started from breaking my jaw playing lacrosse in college. And so one of the first things I put my mind to as a young kid was playing college lacrosse. I wanted to play in college, but I was little. And people thought that it was like a joke, like I would never be able to play at that level. And I remember someone saying to me, "Where do you want to play?" And I said, UNC, North Carolina, where Michael Jordan played basketball. And they have a really good lacrosse team. And the guy laughed at me. I was already playing varsity lacrosse at a young age, and I was already good. And he laughed like, "There's no way you're going to, be able to play lacrosse at North Carolina." And then I went to a hippie festival up in Maine to see Fish. And I was getting recruited pretty heavily at the time. And I had a cell phone at the time just for emergencies. And I checked in with my dad and I said, "Hey, just checking in." And he goes, "Hey, you just got a letter from North Carolina." While I was like in my tent, like smoking, smoking pot or something, like not ready to go see Fish. And I was like, what? And I felt like for a minute, that was like, for me, that like I climbed Mount Rushmore, like they were now actively recruiting me. And then, I ended up not choosing to go to Carolina, but I ended up going to Colorado and playing at the University of Denver. And then I went to UMass, and then I decided I wanted to start a brand because I broke my jaw playing. And then I started a clothing brand that got me onto Shark Tank. People laughed at me when I first told them about Shark Tank. And I was like, no, this is real. And so I started thinking about all these different things, and then moving out here in California and then up to Topanga. And there's been all these weird series. And I realized that it goes back to Yogacara, in my opinion. And so life is a series of seed planting. With every action, with every thought, with everything we do, we are planting seeds moment to moment. And there are seeds that are planted before we're even born, like our DNA and our family's history. Like those are seeds that we couldn't do anything about. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Being born where we're born, and the nationality, the color of our skin, all those things, right? But we have our own seeds that we can proactively plant. Mm-hmm. And once you start planting them, then you have to have the patience to water them and let them grow. And then you have to practice in between and stay focused and disciplined. So I started realizing, I'm like, life actually is pretty simple. If you want something, you have to plant the seed. You have to be patient. You have to water it. You have to practice. You have to be mindful. You have to be present. And you have to be okay with whatever the outcome is. It might not look exactly the way that, like, in your mind you pictured it, but you are planting a seed that will grow into some sort of tree. You know what I mean? The tree you might have wanted, it might have been a pine tree. Maybe it ends up being a spruce tree. You know what I mean? But like, you are planting seeds. Yeah. And so that's sort of become like the core of my philosophy now, is like trying to help people and myself to continue to remind myself that if you want something, plant the seeds, be patient, let it grow. And it's growing, whether you like it or not. But then don't be too attached to the outcome. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because then you're going to be disappointed and you're going to suffer if the tree doesn't grow exactly the way you want it to, or at the pace you want it to, or the height you want it to. So but a lot of us are already doing what we want to do in our lives. We're just anxious about it not happening fast enough. We're not soon enough. We're not looking exactly like it, but you
Yeah.
know, we're doing it, most of us already.
Yeah. Dude, that's beautiful. I really like that image and I like that vision. And, it reminds me of karma in some ways, right? Planting seeds and something I've been thinking about recently is like basically karma in my mind, karma is using your terminology there, basically karma is all of the seeds that have been planted in the past and in my own personal life,
Yeah.
that make me who I am in this given moment right now. And so I usually don't even necessarily think of like bad karma, good karma, like a lot of people do. I just think karma is the law of cause and effect. Basically, it's what has all of the interdependent forces that lead any given thing to be what it is.
Yeah,
Um,
any sentient being that's living and breathing on this planet is going to create karma just by
exactly.
being alive and conscious.
Right, right. So we have that karma, and we have this. I mean, it's living karma. It's every moment you're creating more karma, basically. And then I think about personal dharma in the sense of we all have our personal dharma from a maybe not from a. I'm thinking about this more from a Hindu perspective, maybe than a Buddhist perspective, but the personal dharma being basically kind of what you're talking about in a way, because for me it's like you're taking the karma that you do have and you're trying to skillfully navigate and use that karma to plant better, no, well, no, maybe not better seeds, but seeds that will produce the fruit that you feel most authentic about or something. Um and so I like what you said there. That's great. And you touched on your new vision for the work that you want to do, that you've already started to do,
Yeah.
and which is your own personal dharma. And so I'd love to hear more about that, and I'd love for the listener to hear more about what you're doing. So can you say a little bit about what your vision is for that?
Yeah, I think I sat with Angel City Zen Center and for 10 years, and I got something called Jukai, where I went through a ceremony and I shaved my head, and Brad gave me a Japanese name called Hofu. That stands for Dharma Wind, which is basically the name of my little business now. And
Awesome.
so I decided just to take my practice into my own hands and make it more accessible and available. And it's a big part of the Buddhist tradition, is like taking the teachings out into the world. And there's a famous book called The Diamond Cutter by Michael Roach. And he, was an American, from New York, living in Tibet for many years. And he was done with the 7-year practice period. And he said to his teacher, "Should I stay or should I go back to New York?" And he goes, "Go to Manhattan." And he was surprised. He thought he would tell him to stay. He goes, "What better way to test what you've learned in the last 7 years than to go
Love
to
it.
Manhattan?" And he loved the Diamond Sutra. That was his famous sutra in Buddhism. So on a whim, he decided to get involved in the Diamond District in Manhattan. And he ended up becoming a multimillionaire and super successful just by following his path and his intuition. And so
Yeah.
I feel like I'm doing a little bit the same because I'm entrepreneurial. I have started businesses before, and this is really my passion. So during the pandemic, about a year ago, I started filming, some videos of me up here in my daily practice, and create a website. And I was really amazed at the response I was getting from people that I grew up with back in New York, teachers and friends who want to know more about this lifestyle that I've, adopted. And I want to make it, more accessible to people without a lot of the dogma and a lot of the, robes and bowing and, chanting, just like the core foundational stuff that could really help someone, to create a framework of a more sort of Zen mindful lifestyle. So I've done that, and I've picked up a bunch of clients, and I'm working with a couple of hospitals, in the LA, San Diego area, where I'm actually working with the doctors and nurses specifically, doing like a weekly, nightly meditation with them, where we're doing
Cool.
10 or 15 minutes of Zazen, and I give instruction at the beginning, and then I open up to questions and comments at the end, I usually read a little passage, you know what I mean, from, the Shobogenzo or the Dhammapada or one of the books I'm reading, just something to, spark some conversation, almost like a little bit like a koan.
Yeah.
And, people really seem to be appreciating it and responding to it. And one of the reasons, Matthew, is again with Zazen being like the backbone, it's like no one has the answers other than yourself. You know what I mean? You
Right.
could read books until you're blue in the face.
Right.
And you could go to the mountaintops of Tibet searching for the Dalai Lama, you know what I mean, and the Buddha. And once you get there, he might just hold up a flower, you know what I
Right.
mean, not even say anything to you.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to get people to do is like be comfortable with sitting in their own silence and awkwardness. It's like, let's start with helping you become your own best friend. Like learn to sit with your own discomfort, your own racing, chattery mind. Let's start with that. And then we can kind of like build and build and build on that. And I have one client that I've been working with for a year now. It's been incredible to see his growth and maturation. And, the sits are getting longer. He's asking for more books that are deeper, you know what I mean, and a little bit more advanced. And, it's been cool to see like different people I'm working with, like growing over time with that initial, like starting with that initial 10-minute sit, like, let's just sit together. It's going to be super uncomfortable and awkward your first time, but just try to let it go and be okay with it. You know what I mean? And that's the first seed, again, with the seeds that gets planted. And there's a thought in meditation that if your meditation, your very first one is like a glass of water, that first meditation is like a drop of like food dye or, in the glass of water, the color of the water forever changes.
Yeah.
Your mind forever changes after just one meditation session.
Yeah.
If you keep dropping more, food dye into the cup, the water will change over time. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, rid ourselves of some of the unhealthy thought patterns and habits that we've developed since we've been little kids.
Right.
Trying to divert the water out of a deep riverbed that's been, carved for years and years and years of thoughts and parents and expectations in society. We're trying to divert it potentially into a new, healthier direction. And it takes practice and time and patience. And
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think that it sounds like the way you're approaching it is very practical and in a great way. And it seems like you want to meet people where they're at, and you want to work, you're open to work with like such a variety of people in a variety of settings, and just kind of offering this, practical meditation tools, even if they start really small, and planting that seed for them. I like what you said about, it's kind of like the foundation of it is getting somebody to become their own best friend, or at least become more comfortable with themselves and comfortable with their own awkward silence during meditation, and not want to run away from themselves. Because like you're saying, I mean, we just carry so many things inside of us from our childhoods and from our social expectations and assumptions and insecurities and fears and all those things. And so, most of us don't want to just sit. One of the reasons why we don't want to sit in silence is because we know all that stuff is going to surface.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, no, I just want to keep distracting myself. But, when you stop trying to escape it, I remember one time at the Angel City Zen Center, I was doing a sit there, and I had this kind of epiphany where, because part of me was like, when is the bell gonna ring? When is the bell gonna ring?
Yeah.
And I realized at that moment, I was like, I can just stop waiting. That's the way I framed it. I was like, why am I, at that point, I was waiting for the bell to ring. I'm always waiting for something else. And it's like, no, I want to stop waiting. And that's similar to, people can just learn to stop trying to always distract themselves and just like, oh, this is it. This is enough. I can be right here, right now.
This is enough. And I do want to say one other thing, Matthew, because, we've been friends for, a few years now, and, we've been doing writing workshops for many years. And I know you're part of a very creative community with a lot of creative people that might be listening and watching. And I do want to say that, like, we touched on a little bit earlier, with, Leonard Cohen and Herbie Hancock, but artistic people, creative people, I think sometimes don't realize the power of meditation because they think they always need to be doing something. They always have to be creating, and any second that they're not creating a piece of art or, writing or reading, like, is wasted time.
Right.
What people don't realize is that you actually end up becoming more creative.
Yeah.
You give yourself that space and that time to just like relax and like turn off and like have a little bit of a bird's eye perspective. And I work with a lot of creative people where this practice becomes a hugely important part of that process because it gives you some time and space to reflect and to look at your projects a little more holistically, as opposed to trying to force all this creativity out of yourself, where it's like, yo, relax, take a deep breath, sit down, and then come back to it with like a clear, calm mind. And you'll be amazed at how much creative you can actually be from that.
That's a great point. And I think that for me and other people I've talked to, there's this weird fear, not for all artists, but some writers and artists, they fear that, getting into meditation and cultivating stillness within their lives is actually going to compromise their own creativity because they think that their creativity is kind of fueled by a little bit of restlessness and a little bit of kind of frenetic, like, it's like, wait, what if I kill that, then maybe I won't be creative anymore. But what you're saying is true. And I think, even people like David Lynch or these really creative people that use meditation as a huge part of their creative process. I think it really can, recharge your batteries, defrag your program, however you want to think of it, in a way that actually can really, foster your creativity. As me and you have seen during the Zen workshop, is, we start with the sit and then we write. And there's something amazing about that. I like it a lot.
Absolutely. And I do want to thank you for that also, because, I've adopted that as a part of my methodology also, is I find that the process of sitting and then doing, a stream of consciousness free write after is really powerful. And you could use it in a corporate setting. I mean, if you're dealing with a marketing team and they're trying to solve a problem or come up with a new marketing strategy, having them sit for 10 or 15 minutes in silence and then writing completely stream of conscious and then collecting all those thoughts from the whole group and then sharing them, the amount of beautiful, magical, kind of inspiring ideas that could come out of that gets me excited just thinking about it. And I don't even know what group I'm even talking about. I'm just talking in generality. And so I do want to thank you for, implementing that at Angel City Zen Center. It's been a big part of my practice. And, I've missed the last couple, and it like kills me. I didn't miss one for like years, and I could count on one hand how many times I've missed in 4 years, but I love them so much. And I feel like a lot of people can benefit from them. So I'm actually incorporating, mindful writing workshops into my,
I love that.
Well,
that's such a good idea. You're totally right. And it doesn't even take that long. If somebody sits there for maybe they sit for 15 minutes or something, and then they free write for 15 minutes, and they might have come up with all sorts of ideas that they wouldn't have come up with otherwise. So can you say the name of it again?
It's actually, the website is craigjaredfrench.com. So it's my full name, CraigJaredFrench.com.
Perfect.